Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, we are absolutely thrilled to have you here today.
We really are, because if you are the kind of person who loves connecting historical dots,
Oh, absolutely.
if you live for those profound aha moments where the past suddenly just brilliantly illuminates the present,
Right.
and if you want to understand the incredibly complex currents shaping our world without feeling completely overwhelmed by information overload, well, then you have found exactly the right place to be.
You're in good hands.
Today, we have a very specific mission. We are looking at a single, incredibly sweeping, and frankly fascinating piece of geopolitical and historical analysis.
It's a massive text.
It really is. We're unpacking an article by Iqbal Akhtar. It's titled, "The Shia World's Khilafat Moment,
Yeah.
The Killing of Ayatollah Khamenei and the End of Political Islam's Last State Project."
Yeah, and it is essentially a masterclass in Middle Eastern geopolitics, Islamic history, and political philosophy, all rolled into one incredible narrative.
It really is a phenomenal text to explore.
Akhtar is doing something incredibly ambitious here. He's not just giving us a dry timeline of current events.
Right, it's not a standard news recap.
Exactly. He is offering a grand, overarching historical framework. He's asking us to look at the immediate, chaotic, often terrifying events of the present and see the deep, century-long structural patterns underneath them.
I mean, it is the kind of analysis that requires us to synthesize very diverse fields,
Yeah, history, theology, economics, international relations.
pulling it all into one coherent picture.
Right.
But before we get any further, before we even, start to pull on these threads, we have to pause and set some very strict, mandatory ground rules for this deep dive.
Yes, absolutely. This is crucial.
I cannot emphasize enough how crucial this is. The source material we're examining today deals with highly charged, deeply sensitive, and ongoing modern political events.
It touches on military strikes, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the actions of the Iranian government.
And the broader, often violent geopolitical struggles in the Middle East.
These are issues that affect millions of lives. They involve deeply held religious beliefs and, frankly, profound human suffering.
Right. And because of that intense reality, we need to make something explicitly crystal clear to you, the listener. We, as your hosts, are strictly impartial in this discussion.
Strictly impartial.
We are absolutely not taking any sides. We're not endorsing any state's actions, nor are we validating, promoting, or defending the political viewpoints presented in the text by the author.
Right.
Our sole mission today, our only goal, is to unpack the author's arguments and impartially report on the ideas contained in this original source material.
We are here to act as your guides through the author's intellectual framework, to help you understand what is being argued.
Nothing more and nothing less.
Precisely. We are analyzing the text as a piece of scholarship and political theory.
We're looking at the mechanics of the argument.
The historical parallels the author draws and the evidence he presents to back up his claims. We leave the political judgments and the moral conclusions entirely up to you.
Okay, with that vital disclaimer firmly in place, let's drop the central, shocking premise of the text right here at the start.
Let's do it.
This is the hook that drives this entire massive analysis. The author, Iqbal Akhtar, argues that the dramatic geopolitical events culminating in the February 2026 death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei are not just another geopolitical headline.
Right.
He argues that they are structurally identical to one of the most profound, world-altering events of the entire 20th century.
He's drawing a direct line to the 1924 abolition of the Ottoman caliphate.
Exactly. He is saying that what happened to Sunni political Islam 100 years ago, that total structural collapse of a transnational dream, has just happened to Shia political Islam today.
What's fascinating here is the sheer audacity and scale of that comparison.
Massive.
The author is taking an event that fundamentally shattered the political imagination of the Muslim world a century ago and saying, look closely at the architecture of what is happening right now.
The exact same structural collapse is happening before our very eyes.
Just in a different theological register. It forces us to ask a really heavy question.
Which is?
What actually happens to millions of people when a transnational religious political project completely evaporates?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why this 2026 moment is so monumental, we can't just start in 2026.
No, we have to start at the chronological beginning of the author's framework.
We have to travel back a full century to March 1924.
Right.
This is when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk makes a decision that sends absolute shockwaves across the globe. He officially dissolves the Ottoman caliphate.
Now, we all know from basic history that empires fall,
Sure.
but the text frames this as something much deeper than just a regime change.
Why was this such a psychological earthquake?
We really need to pause and appreciate the weight of that loss. The author relies heavily here on the work of historian Mona Hassan.
Good.
She's written brilliantly on this concept of transregional collective loss.
Transregional collective loss.
Right. When Ataturk dissolved that institution, he wasn't just firing a political official or updating a constitutional clause in a newly formed Turkish republic.
He was severing a symbolic thread that had existed for over 13 centuries.
13 centuries, that's almost unfathomable in modern political terms.
It is. I mean, for over a millennium, the global Muslim community, the Ummah, had a living, breathing center of political and spiritual authority.
Even when the caliphate was politically weak, as it frankly often was in its later centuries, it existed as a unifying symbol.
It was the ultimate horizon of belonging.
To put it in perspective, imagine if tomorrow an institution that had defined the overarching identity of your civilization since the Middle Ages was just
Erased.
erased by a stroke of a pen.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. It's like the anchor of your entire worldview is just cut loose.
Completely.
But reading through the notes, there was a part of Akhtar's argument that really surprised me. He brings in the research of Simel Aydin, and Aydin argues that our modern understanding of this idea of a unified Muslim world or pan-Islamism wasn't actually this ancient, timeless reality.
It wasn't.
I always assumed the Muslim world had always viewed itself as one giant unified political bloc since the 7th century.
It's a very common assumption, but Aydin's research shatters it. This is a crucial piece of context for the whole discussion.
Right.
Pan-Islamism as a coherent, organized political ideology was actually a remarkably modern construct. It really only emerged in the late 19th century.
So it's basically a Victorian-era invention.
In terms of its modern political application, yes. And it didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was a highly reactive formation.
Right.
It was a direct defense mechanism against the encroaching, racializing logic of European imperialism.
Think about what the world looked like in the late 1800s.
European empires, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Russians were rapidly carving up the globe, subjugating incredibly diverse populations.
And they were often categorizing these subjugated people along deeply racist civilizational lines.
Exactly.
So they were looking at millions of diverse people from Morocco to Indonesia and just stamping them all as the Orientals or the Mohammedans.
Yes. They were flattening the incredible diversity of these societies into a single subordinate racial category to justify ruling them.
Wow.
So Muslim intellectuals realized they needed a counter-narrative. The text points to a fascinating figure here, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani.
Okay.
He is really the quintessential architect of this modern pan-Islamic thought.
What was his pitch? I mean, how do you unify such a massive, diverse group of people against the British Empire?
Al-Afghani essentially looked at the geopolitical board and argued, the Europeans are expanding territorially, and their strategy is to dominate us by dividing us.
They want us fighting over local borders or ethnic differences.
Exactly. He said the only way to resist this modern, industrialized imperial machinery is to forge our own modern, transnational solidarity.
And the only identity marker strong enough to link someone in Cairo with someone in Delhi was their shared faith.
That makes so much sense when you frame it that way.
It really does. It wasn't that they had always acted as one political unit for 1,000 years. It's that in the face of a global empire, they needed a global resistance identity.
They were trying to build an ideological fortress against colonialism.
Precisely. The idea of the Muslim world as a unified political bloc was a defensive strategy forged in the crucible of late 19th century geopolitics.
But here is where the text throws a massive historical curveball. When that fortress finally collapses in 1924, when the caliphate is abolished by Ataturk, you would naturally think the shockwaves would be felt most intensely right next door, right?
In the Arab heartlands.
Oh.
Places like Egypt or Syria or the Arabian Peninsula where Islam originated.
But the author points out that the loss was actually felt most acutely thousands of miles away.
In South Asia. In India.
Yes.
Why did Indian Muslims care so deeply about a Turkish sultan losing his job?
It is a brilliant historical anomaly, and understanding it perfectly sets up the parallel Akhtar is going to draw later with the modern Iranian diaspora.
So why South Asia?
Well, if we look at the historical context, the Arab nations were already beginning to experiment with other ideas. They had pan-Arabism, they were developing local secular nationalisms.
They had ideological alternatives ready to go.
Exactly. But South Asian Muslims were in a uniquely vulnerable, almost precarious position. They existed as a minority population, completely subsumed under British colonial rule.
And Akhtar mentions they had lost their own native political power long before this. He brings up the end of the Mughal dynasty.
Yes, for centuries, the Mughal Empire had been this magnificent, powerful Muslim dynasty ruling over a Hindu-majority India.
Right.
But once the British fully dismantled the Mughal Empire in the mid-19th century, Indian Muslims found themselves fundamentally unmoored.
They were suddenly without any native sovereign political leadership.
They were subjects of a distant European Christian crown, living as a minority among a massive Hindu majority.
So they were feeling entirely squeezed out of history.
Entirely. So, for them, the Ottoman Caliphate, however geographically distant it might have been, and even if they didn't speak Turkish or know much about Istanbul,
It took on an outsized, incredibly idealized significance.
it was the ultimate living proof that Muslims could still possess actual political sovereignty somewhere in the world.
It's like a psychological safety net. Like, we might be subjects here in Delhi, but the Caliph in Istanbul is still standing tall.
Exactly. It offered a horizon of belonging that transcended the artificial colonial borders drawn by the British.
The pan-Islamists in India genuinely viewed those colonial borders as a deliberate European strategy of divide and rule.
To them, loyalty to the caliphate was the ultimate anti-colonial statement.
Which brings us to a massive historical phenomenon that the text highlights, and frankly, something I don't think gets talked about enough.
The Khilafat movement?
Yes, the Khilafat movement. This ran from 1919 to 1924. The author relies on the detailed historical research of Aisha Jalal and Gail Knoll to explain this.
And reading their accounts, this wasn't just a handful of intellectuals writing angry letters to the editor.
No, this was a massive grassroots mobilization of millions of Indian Muslims.
It was one of the largest political mobilizations of the era. And Asha Jalal's research is so vital here because she shows that for these Indian Muslims,
Figures like the famous Ali brothers or the scholar Abul Kalam Azad.
right, for them, this wasn't just some abstract theological debate. It was a lived, desperate aspiration.
The idea that Muslims could constitute a political community defined entirely by faith rather than by the oppressive colonial territory they lived in was the very core of their political identity.
And the caliphate was the anchor holding that identity in place.
And the political alliances this created were just wild. The text points out that Mahatma Gandhi, who was of course a devout Hindu and the leader of the Indian nationalist movement, actually formed the All India Khilafat Committee in 1919.
He allied directly with these Muslim leaders who were protesting for a Turkish caliph.
It sounds contradictory at first glance, doesn't it?
It does, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, Gandhi was a master strategist. He recognized the immense mobilizing power of this pan-Islamic sentiment.
By championing a cause that Indian Muslims cared about so deeply, saving the Ottoman Caliphate from being carved up by the British and the French after World War I.
He brought them completely into the fold of his broader non-cooperation movement against British rule in India.
It's framed as perhaps the most remarkable example of anti-colonial Hindu-Muslim solidarity in South Asian history.
You had Hindus and Muslims marching together, boycotting British goods together, going to jail together.
All loosely tethered to this idea of preserving an Islamic institution in Turkey.
It was a brief, shining moment of unified resistance, but it was entirely dependent on the survival of that distant symbol.
And then 1924 happens.
The symbol is destroyed.
Not by the British, but by the Turks themselves. Ataturk pulls the plug. He abolishes the caliphate to modernize and secularize Turkey.
And the text notes that the aftermath, the collapse of this beautiful pan-Islamic dream in India and elsewhere, was incredibly swift and chaotic.
It was absolutely devastating for the movement. I mean, you can't protest the British to save the caliphate when the caliphate no longer exists.
They tried to salvage it, of course. The text mentions a fascinating, somewhat tragic event.
The 1926 Cairo Caliphate Congress.
Right. They basically called an emergency global summit.
They brought delegates from all over the Muslim world to Egypt to try and agree on a way to restore the institution.
Okay, the Turks don't want it. Who takes it next?
But it was a complete failure.
They couldn't agree on who should be the new caliph, where it should be based, or what actual executive power it should have.
The underlying painful reality was exposed for everyone to see.
The political energy of the Ummah had permanently fragmented. The era of the transnational empire was over.
The dream of a borderless, unified political community was dead. And the author cites the scholar James Piscatori here, who formulated a really profound conclusion about what happened in the decades following 1924.
Piscatori noted that instead of Islam replacing the nation-state, which was the whole point of pan-Islamism, to transcend borders,
the nation-state simply became an Islamic value.
that is the crucial pivot of the 20th century for the Middle East. Once the transnational option was definitively gone, Muslims everywhere had to channel their collective aspirations into the very nation-state system that pan-Islamism was originally designed to resist.
The nation-state won.
The borders drawn by the colonial powers largely became permanent, and religion had to figure out how to exist within those national borders rather than transcending them.
Okay, so I want you, the listener, to keep that entire historical arc in your mind. The idealized transnational dream, the sudden, shocking collapse of the central authority, the desperate failure to rebuild it, and the forced eventual acceptance of the nation-state.
Because now, the author transitions us away from the 1920s and brings us into the contemporary timeline.
We are fast-forwarding to the chaotic events culminating in 2026.
And this brings us right to the core of Akhtar's argument about the Shia world's Khilafat moment.
The author is arguing that the Islamic Republic of Iran, established by the 1979 revolution, was essentially the last serious, heavily state-backed attempt to prove James Piscatori wrong.
They wanted to prove that the transnational dream wasn't dead.
Exactly. It was the last great effort to demonstrate that an Islamic political theology could successfully organize a modern state, ignore Westphalian borders, project its power across the region, and offer a genuine, viable alternative to the Western-dominated international order.
Iran wasn't just trying to be a country. It was trying to be the vanguard of a global movement.
But the author details a terrifyingly rapid cascade of events that dismantle that entire project.
According to the text, between 2023 and 2026, we see the complete, systematic collapse of what Iran called its axis of resistance.
The timeline Akhtar presents is stark.
It outlines the methodical destruction of Hamas in Gaza, the decimation of Hezbollah's leadership and infrastructure in Lebanon, and the neutralizing of the Houthi militias in Yemen.
These weren't just allies. These were the forward operating bases of the Iranian transnational project.
And the climax of this collapse, the absolute focal point of the article, is the February 28, 2026, joint American-Israeli strikes that resulted in the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the historical parallel the author is drawing becomes incredibly, almost chillingly stark.
Just as Ataturk's action in 1924 created a massive vacuum of Sunni political identity and authority,
the events of February 2026 marked the collapse of the only state project that ever attempted to turn Shia Islam into a comprehensive, governing political ideology.
So it's not just a geopolitical loss, it's an existential collapse.
Precisely. The death of the supreme leader, the Valier Faqih, under these circumstances, isn't just a change in administration.
It's not just a blow to Iranian national security.
In the author's view, it is the definitive end of an era. The transnational structure is broken.
Akhtar uses very strong, uncompromising language here. He says this event exposes the total bankruptcy of the entire Iranian state project.
Politically, economically, and most importantly, morally.
The post-1979 dream has essentially evaporated as a viable transnational force.
So what does this all mean? I mean, how did a project that started with such incredible world-shaking revolutionary fervor in 1979 end up completely bankrupt by 2026?
To answer that, we have to look under the hood of the Iranian state.
We can't just look at the missiles and the militias.
No, we have to understand the specific theological machinery that powered the whole thing.
This is where Akhtar's analysis becomes truly profound, because he argues that the seeds of this 2026 collapse were actually planted in 1979 in the very theology that created the state in the first place.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
We are pivoting from the geopolitical battlefield to a theological deep dive. And I have to admit, as someone who reads a lot of history, I was blown away by this section of the text.
It's eye-opening.
Because the entire system of the Islamic Republic rests on a doctrine introduced by Ayatollah Khamenei in 1979. It's known as Velayat-e Faqih, which translates roughly to the guardianship of the Islamic jurist.
Right.
Now, I always assume this was just standard traditional Shia practice that Khomeini finally got the chance to implement, but the text says that's completely false.
It is a massive misconception. And the text relies on the deep jurisprudential analysis of scholars like Hamid Mavani and Norman Calder to unpack just how insanely radical Khomeini's concept actually was.
Khomeini didn't just stand up and say, hey, as a cleric, I think religious values should guide our laws.
He made a staggering, unprecedented theological claim.
He asserted that the senior Islamic jurist, the supreme leader, possesses the exact same absolute ruling authority over society as the Prophet Muhammad and the 12 imams of Shia tradition.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand the gravity of that. To a layperson, comparing yourself to a prophet might just sound like standard over-the-top religious political rhetoric.
Right.
But in the context of classical Islamic theology, how big of a leap is that?
It is an astronomical leap. It's practically reinventing their religion.
The text points out that historically, for over 1,000 years, traditional Shia guardianship, the concept of wilaya, was strictly limited. It was incredibly mundane.
Mundane how? I mean, what did a cleric actually do before 1979?
They handled non-litigious matters. For centuries, the absolute consensus among Shia scholars was that in the absence of the hidden 12th imam, the messianic figure who is believed to be in occultation and will return at the end of times.
True, perfect political authority is impossible.
Therefore, religious scholars had a duty to guide the community in matters of faith, to answer questions about prayer and fasting.
And they had legal guardianship over very specific vulnerable elements of society.
Managing the affairs of orphans, protecting widows, and administering unclaimed property or endowments. That was it.
Wait, so the historical role of the guardian was essentially acting as a high-level social worker and trust manager.
Exactly. It was a duty of communal care. Absolutely not a mandate for executive political power, let alone commanding armies or dictating foreign policy.
As Norman Calder showed in his foundational study, classical Shia jurisprudence had always maintained a very careful, pragmatic balance.
It held on to its theological idealism, waiting for the true imam to return, while making practical, quiet accommodations with whoever happened to hold secular political power at the time.
Whether it was a Shah or a sultan,
Khomeini deliberately took a sledgehammer to that centuries-old balance.
he took a concept designed to protect orphans and stretched it to cover the absolute dictatorial rule of a modern, industrialized nation-state.
That is wild.
And the text reveals a genuinely shocking detail about how he justified this massive power grab to the other clerics.
When Khomeini presented the religious texts of the Hadith, which are the recorded sayings and traditions of the Prophet and the Imams to support this expansion of power, the text says those specific Hadith were actually considered weak.
What does that mean in this context?
This is a devastating point in the realm of Islamic jurisprudence. To understand this, we have to talk about the science of Hadith. In Islamic scholarship, you can't just claim the Prophet said something.
Every single Hadith has a chain of transmission attached to it called an isnad.
It's like a highly formalized, centuries-long game of telephone. I heard from my teacher, who heard from his father, who heard from the companion of the Prophet.
So it's basically citing your sources all the way back to the 7th century.
Yes. And Islamic scholars have spent lifetimes rigorously evaluating these chains. They look at the biographies of every single person in that chain.
Was this person known to have a bad memory?
Was this person known to exaggerate?
Did this person actually live in the same city as the person they supposedly heard it from?
If there is a break in the chain or an unreliable narrator, the hadith is classified as da'if, meaning weak or unreliable.
And you're saying the core text Khomeini used to build a modern superpower were rated as weak?
The text notes that the chains of transmission for the specific handful of Hadith Khomeini relied upon to justify absolute political rule by clerics were largely classified as da'if by traditional rigorous standards.
They were not the strong, universally accepted text that you would normally use to upend centuries of theology.
So the very foundational bedrock of this entire political system was fundamentally shaky from day one.
Which raises a massive question for me. If this system wasn't rooted in solid traditional Shia theology, where on earth did Khomeini get the idea?
This raises an important question, and Akhtar turns to historians and scholars like Hamid Dabashi and Vali Nasser for the answer.
They argue that the 1979 system wasn't really an expression of traditional Shia piety at all.
It was actually a highly modern, incredibly synthesized political ideology. Khomeini was essentially a theological hacker.
He was borrowing heavily from sources far, far outside Islamic tradition.
The text uses a phrase that made me do a double take. Plato and Marx meet Islam.
Okay, let's unpack that, Marx, in a fundamentalist Islamic republic. How does that work?
It's an incredible ideological patchwork. Let's start with Plato. Vali Nasser points out that Khomeini's vision of a society ruled by an elite class of specially trained, morally superior ascetic jurists looks a whole lot less like early Islamic history in Medina.
And a whole lot more like Plato's Republic.
The concept of the philosopher king.
Exactly. It's the philosopher king and the guardian class, just dressed in clerical robes and turbans.
Plato argued that only those who truly understand the forms of goodness should rule. Khomeini just substituted Islamic jurisprudence for Platonic philosophy.
And the Marxist element.
Hamid Dabashi notes that the revolutionary fervor of 1979, the aggressive anti-imperialist rhetoric, the framing of the entire global struggle as the oppressed masses, the Mustazafin rising up against the corrupt capitalist elite, the Mustakbirins.
That entire vocabulary was heavily lifted from 20th century Marxist and Third Worldist revolutionary theory.
Because that was the dominant revolutionary language of the 1970s.
Right. Leftist Marxist movements were highly active in Iran leading up to the revolution.
Yeah.
Khomeini was brilliant at co-opting their energy.
He took Plato's rigid, elitist structure of governance, took Marx's explosive revolutionary energy and language of class struggle, and grafted it all onto a very specific, stretched, weak hadith-based interpretation of Shia law.
It's basically a political Frankenstein's monster.
And because it was so contrived, it immediately ran into practical problems.
I want to ask you about this massive constitutional paradox the text highlights, which occurred in 1989. Because this seems like the moment the ideology truly broke.
1989 is a critical turning point. This is the year Ayatollah Khamenei dies. The system now faces its first succession crisis.
According to the constitution they wrote in 1979, the supreme leader had to be a marja.
A marja being a top-ranking cleric.
Yes, a source of emulation. The absolute highest level of jurist, someone universally recognized for their unparalleled mastery of Islamic law.
The logic was, if the ruler has the same authority as the prophet, they better be the most learned person alive.
But there was a huge problem.
The person they politically wanted to take over, Ali Khamenei, wasn't a marja.
Not even close. He was a mid-ranking cleric. He had strong political credentials, he was loyal to the revolution, but he absolutely did not have the scholarly chops required by their own constitution.
So what did they do? Did they find a better scholar?
No. They simply changed the rules of the game. They quickly amended the Constitution.
They removed the strict requirement that the supreme leader had to be a top-ranking jurist.
The scholar, said Amir Arjamand, points out the profound, glaring irony here, which defined the next 4 decades of the Islamic Republic.
They continually expanded the absolute dictatorial political power of the supreme leader, while simultaneously diminishing the actual scholarly and theological qualifications required to hold that office.
They basically admitted that the theology didn't matter anymore. It was entirely about maintaining political control.
Precisely. The mask slipped.
And because of all of this, the weak texts, the Platonic borrowing, the constitutional hypocrisy, the author emphasizes that the project was always deeply theologically contested from the inside.
This isn't just Western analysts saying this doesn't make sense. Top-tier Shia scholars have been rejecting this since 1979.
The text introduces the research of Mohsen Kadivar. He's a calm-trained scholar, a brilliant mind now at Duke University. What did Kadivar find?
Kadivar did something remarkable. He conducted a systematic, exhaustive review of all the revered classical Shia texts and centuries of Islamic legal rulings.
His findings are a total devastating refutation of the Iranian state's ideology from within its own tradition.
He demonstrated that within the classical texts, you can actually find jurisprudential support for 9 distinct forms of government.
9 different ways to run a state according to Shia Islam.
Yes, ranging from consultative assemblies to conditional monarchies. But Kadivar found that the one specific form of government that is not validated by the traditions of the Prophet or the Imams,
the one that has no solid basis in the history of the faith,
is absolute valet de facto.
The exact system ruling Iran.
Yes. The state's foundational, unshakable doctrine is, in reality, a massive theological outlier. It's a modern invention masquerading as ancient tradition.
Okay, so let's summarize where we are. You have a system built on weak traditions. It's borrowing heavily from Greek philosophy and Marxist rhetoric.
It's constantly altering its own constitutional rules just to maintain power for its political insiders.
And it is fundamentally rejected by its own top theologians. It's no wonder the author calls it a bankrupt project.
And that brings us to the actual ledger of this bankruptcy. Akhtar asks us to look past the rhetoric and look at the hard numbers, the actual human and economic costs of this 4-decade experiment in transnational revolution.
Let's start with the external costs. The sheer scale of Iran's investment in its axis of resistance is staggering.
The figures cited in the text represent a massive, generation-defining diversion of national wealth. Akhtar notes that we are talking about an estimated $30 to $50 billion spent over 4 decades.
Just pause on that number. Up to $50 billion.
And that money wasn't spent on domestic infrastructure. It was entirely dedicated to building, arming, and funding proxy militias across the Middle East.
The text traces the origins of this all the way back to 1982, right? Which is incredible, because Iran was in the middle of a brutal existential war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq at the time.
Yes, the Iran-Iraq war was raging. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians were dying. The economy was under immense strain.
Yet, despite that domestic crisis, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, dispatched 1,500 highly trained instructors to Lebanon's Bekaa Valley.
To do what?
To essentially build Hezbollah from scratch. They found disparate Shia militias, unified them, trained them, funded them, and infused them with Khomeini's ideology.
They prioritized exporting the revolution to the Mediterranean over securing their own borders.
And the text points out this pattern never stopped. Decades later, when the Assad regime in Syria was on the brink of collapse during the Syrian civil war, Iran didn't just send money.
They sacrificed 2,100 of their own soldiers, IRGC and regular army, and spent billions more just to keep a brutal, secular dictator in power.
Because he was a crucial link in their proxy network.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is making a profound point about state priorities and the nature of this project.
The entire strategic orientation of the Islamic Republic, its vast oil wealth, its military capability, its diplomatic capital was never directed toward the productive, creative flourishing of Iranian society.
It wasn't about building a strong economy, modernizing schools, or improving the lives of everyday citizens.
It was entirely obsessively oriented outward.
It was dedicated to the destruction of Israel, the destabilization of Arab rivals, and the projection of this revolutionary anti-Western ideology.
They treated their own country like a resource extraction mechanism to fund a foreign empire. And what was the return on that massive $50 billion investment?
According to the timeline in the text, the return has been catastrophic. Let's look at the external collapse first. The author cites a brilliant analysis by Chatham House, specifically by Sanam Vakil in 2024.
What did her research conclude?
Vakil's analysis was incredibly prescient. She concluded long before the final collapse that this entire axis of resistance was always built on incredibly fragile foundations.
It looked intimidating on paper, a ring of fire around Israel, missiles in Yemen, militias in Iraq.
But Vakil argued it was a mirage of power projection, not genuine, sustainable strategic depth. It relied on a level of continuous funding and ideological zeal that simply couldn't survive intense pressure.
And we see that fragility brutally exposed in the timeline the author provides. The unraveling doesn't happen overnight. It's a cascading failure.
It begins with the brutal Gaza war in October 2023, which fundamentally destabilizes the region.
It accelerates dramatically with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria in December 2024.
Which was a massive, irreplaceable loss of a state ally and a vital logistical land bridge to Lebanon.
But the real proof of the hollowness, the moment the mirage vanishes, comes during what the text calls the June 2025 war. When the pressure was finally applied to the entire network, what happened?
The entire proxy network went silent. That's the stunning part. After decades of rhetoric about unity and resisting together, the architecture collapsed.
Hezbollah and Hamas were unable to act in a coordinated way, having been systemically decimated.
And the Houthis in Yemen and the Shia militias in Iraq looked at the situation and were simply unwilling to risk their own domestic survival for Tehran's grand strategy.
The axis proved to be transactional, not unbreakable. When it was finally tested in a total conflict, it shattered.
The external projection failed entirely. But the author argues that the internal catastrophe, what happened within Iran itself, is perhaps even more damning to the legacy of the Islamic Republic.
Because we often hear about the protests, but the text pivots to the domestic front and reveals some truly stunning, hard statistics about what 4 decades of theocracy have actually produced in the hearts and minds of Iranian society.
This is where the deepest paradox of political Islam is most evident. It is the ultimate cautionary tale.
The author argues that by forcing religion into every single aspect of state control, by making it the law, the police, the economy, the censor, the theocracy, actually produced massive, widespread secularization by coercion.
Because if you hate the government and the government says it speaks for God, you end up resenting God.
Exactly. When the state is religion, rejecting the corruption and oppression of the state inherently means rejecting the religion it claims to champion.
The data the text provides here is mind-blowing. It cites the sociologist Misa Parsa and the Goman Polling Institute.
We aren't talking about a recent shift. The text notes that by the year 2000, 75% of Iranians had stopped performing the obligatory daily prayers.
Think about that for a second. In a state that claims to be a divine republic, governed by God's representatives on earth, 3/4 of the population gave up the most basic pillar of Islamic practice decades ago.
Furthermore, the text points out that today over half of the country's mosques are completely inactive or abandoned. They are empty structures.
And when Gammon conducts anonymous, secure polling, approximately 73% of the population openly favors the complete secular separation of religion and state.
They aren't asking for a milder version of theocracy. They have lived the reality of clerical rule, and an overwhelming majority want it permanently ended.
And then there's a statistic that genuinely made me pause. It's perhaps the most jarring symbol of this disconnect.
The text states that Iranian citizens are spending an estimated $12 billion annually on alcohol.
$12 billion. Now put that in context. This is a country struggling with crippling sanctions and inflation.
And more importantly, alcohol is strictly, severely forbidden by the state religion. The penalty for a first offense of drinking is 80 lashes with a whip. Yet there's a $12 billion underground industry.
What's fascinating here is what that number represents sociologically. It's not just about a desire for consumption or partying.
In the context of the Islamic Republic, it's a massive, multi-billion-dollar daily act of societal defiance.
Every sip is a rejection of the state's moral authority. It shows a population that is completely, irrecoverably alienated from the moral dictates of the regime.
The state tries to micromanage piety, and the population responds by building massive underground networks to bypass the state entirely.
You summarized it perfectly in our prep notes for this deep dive.
A regime that claimed to govern in God's name ultimately produced a population fleeing God's house.
The ideological exhaustion inside Iran is total. The people are done.
Done with the ideology, done with the proxies, done with the clerics.
So internally, the project is a hollow shell, and externally, the proxies are gone. The state is bankrupt on every ledger.
But here is where Akhtar introduces a completely fascinating new dimension to the analysis, something I hadn't considered at all.
He says that to truly understand the emotional and historical impact of this 2026 collapse, we can't just look inside Iran. We have to zoom out and look at the global Shia diaspora.
Yes, the text introduces a great, highly descriptive term here, the global Iranification of Shia Islam.
The author draws on his own extensive anthropological research regarding the Khoja Shia communities in East Africa, as well as looking at massive populations in Pakistan and even communities right here in the U.S., like in Dearborn, Michigan.
What does Iranification actually mean in practice?
It means that the 1979 Iranian Revolution didn't just stay within Iran's borders. It fundamentally, aggressively reshaped the religious practice, the communal identity, and the political orientation of Shia Muslims all over the world, even those who had no ethnic or linguistic connection to Iran.
So it wasn't just organic inspiration. Tehran was actively pushing this.
Highly active. They didn't just hope people would be inspired by Khomeini. They built a massive, well-funded machinery to export the ideology.
The text mentions institutions like the Bilal Muslim Mission in East Africa. Tehran utilized massive clerical networks, funded publications, and crucially, they strategically distributed thousands of seminary scholarships to bring foreign students from Pakistan, Africa, and the West to study in the holy city of Qom in Iran.
So they train the next generation of global clerics in the theology of the revolution and send them back home.
Exactly. And through these institutions, drawing on the work of scholars like Lawrence Luer and Toby Mathieson, the text shows how Tehran successfully shifted the entire global discourse of what it meant to be a Shia Muslim.
What was it like before 1979?
Before the revolution, Shia identity in these diaspora communities was often highly quietist. It was focused on local community building, traditional piety, mourning the historical martyrs, and generally staying out of high-stakes geopolitics.
Tehran reframed all of that. They made modern Shia identity inherently political.
They made it inherently oppositional, deeply anti-Western, and intimately tied to the success of the Iranian state.
They exported the revolutionary literature, modernized the celebration of martyrdom narratives, and effectively turned a diverse global religious community into a sympathetic, mobilized audience for the Iranian regime's foreign policy.
But here's the devastating irony that the text analyzes, and honestly, it is the emotional core of Akhtar's entire argument.
The diaspora communities, who were often the most enthusiastic cheerleaders for the Iranian Revolution, the ones who hung pictures of Khomeini in their homes and most deeply internalized this oppositional identity.
They never actually had to live under it.
This raises an incredibly important question about the nature of ideological commitment. It's easy to be a revolutionary from afar.
These diaspora communities bought the ideology without ever having to suffer its daily reality.
Right. They could celebrate the anti-imperialist rhetoric, the speeches defying America from the safety of functioning democracies or relatively stable states.
They could feel a sense of pride that a Shia state was standing up to the world.
But they never had to deal with the 50% inflation, the collapsing currency, the brutal morality police beating women in the streets, the rampant corruption of the IRGC, or the sheer stifling oppression that actual Iranians inside the country were enduring every single day.
The text notes an incredibly poignant reality. The pro-Iranian revolutionary sentiment was often far more fervent in places like Pakistan or Dearborn than it was in Tehran.
The citizens of Iran had grown deeply, bitterly disillusioned with the mullahs decades ago. They knew the reality.
While some of the diaspora were still tightly holding on to the romanticized, pure 1979 ideal that had been sold to them.
So when the geopolitical collapse finally comes in 2026, when the supreme leader is killed and the state project shatters, the emotional experience is totally bifurcated.
Exactly. For the people inside Iran, the fall of the Vilayat-e Faqih is a moment of profound relief.
It's the end of a corrupt, suffocating government they had endured for generations. It's the lifting of a crushing weight.
But for the diaspora who had anchored their religious and political identity to the idea of this invincible righteous state,
it is the evaporation of an idea they cherished. It is a profound, disorienting crisis of identity.
And this is where the genius of the author's framework becomes clear, because this brings us right back to the central hook of the article, right back to the South Asian Muslims of 1924.
The parallel is absolutely perfect. It is a stunning historical rhyme.
Think about those Indian Muslims in the Khilafat movement we talked about earlier. Gandhi's allies. They were fiercely idealizing an Ottoman rule that they never actually lived under.
They invested the distant Turkish caliphate with a symbolic spiritual perfection that far exceeded the messy, corrupt, failing political reality of the late Ottoman Empire.
And when Ataturk finally abolished it, the grief, the psychological shock, was most profound precisely among those Indian Muslims who had idealized it the most, not the Turks who lived it.
The author is arguing that the 2026 Shia diaspora is experiencing the exact same psychological trauma as the 1924 Sunni diaspora in India.
The dream is dead. And the hardest pill to swallow is the realization that the reality of the dream was never what they thought it was in the first place. The transnational anchor is gone.
So the grand project has failed. The state is bankrupt, the proxies are destroyed, the theology is exposed as a modern invention, and the global diaspora is in a state of shock.
This brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial section of our deep dive. The post-Islamist horizon. The dust is settling. What on earth comes next?
To frame what comes next, Akhtar introduces the foundational theories of two prominent scholars, Olivier Roy and Asef Bayat. These are thinkers who saw this coming a long time ago.
Roy wrote a highly influential book way back in 1994 called The Failure of Political Islam.
1994, that's incredibly early to call it.
It was. But Roy argued 3 decades ago that Islamist movements, despite their massive revolutionary energy and ability to mobilize the masses in opposition, had fundamentally failed in their core goal.
They could not create genuinely Islamic states, economies, or societies.
He predicted that once these movements actually seized power and had to run a country collecting garbage, managing currency, dealing with trade, they would inevitably succumb to the exact same mundane governance failures, corruption, and realpolitik as the secular autocrats they had replaced.
The religious veneer would just become a tool of oppression.
Which is exactly what we just described happening in Iran. And then there's Asef Bayat, who coined the term post-Islamism in 1996. What does post-Islamism actually mean? Is it just secularism?
Not exactly secularism. Bayat described post-Islamism as a specific social and political condition. It emerges when the Islamists themselves and the societies they govern become intensely aware of the anomalies and the utter inadequacies of their own political discourse.
The spell breaks. They realize the system simply doesn't work. The
Right.
economy is ruined. The youth are alienated.
So society begins seeking ways to transcend the fundamentalist project. They try to find a way to fuse religiosity with democratic rights, rather than using religion as a weapon to deny rights.
The author argues that the total collapse in 2026 is the most dramatic, undeniable, empirical confirmation of both Roy's and Bayat's theories that we have ever seen.
Political Islam, as a comprehensive state-building project, is exhausted. It's done.
It has run its course.
So, if the revolutionary state-led Islamist model is dead, what are the alternatives? Nature abhors a vacuum.
The text lays out two major competing visions that are now vying for the future of the Muslim world's relationship with modernity, governance, and the global order. Let's look at Vision 1 first, the Abraham Accords model.
This is the model heavily championed by states like the United Arab Emirates and increasingly Saudi Arabia under its current leadership.
It is a deeply pragmatic, almost aggressively post-ideological vision.
It proposes that Muslim-majority states can and must integrate fully into the Western-led global economy. They argue for normalizing relations with Israel, focusing entirely on national prosperity, artificial intelligence, tourism, and technological advancement.
It's the let's build gleaming cities, host international sporting events, and create sovereign wealth funds approach, leaving the dusty revolutionary rhetoric and the proxy wars behind. It's highly appealing from an economic standpoint.
It is. But Akhtar points out a massive glowing vulnerability in this model. It suffers from a severe, potentially fatal legitimacy deficit.
What do you mean by that?
If we look at the actual data, the author cites Arab barometer polling, which is frequently referenced by scholars like Mark Lynch and Cole Bunzel.
This data consistently shows that overwhelming majorities of Arab publics deeply, viscerally reject normalization with Israel.
And the sheer brutality of the Gaza war in the preceding years has made that gap between what the wealthy, elite autocrats want and what the popular sentiment on the street feels even wider and more volatile.
So the Abraham Accords model offers sleek economic integration, but it operates in direct, almost arrogant defiance of the emotional and political sympathies of its own citizens. It's a top-down mandate.
Exactly. It might look stable from the windows of a skyscraper in Dubai, but underneath, it's brittle. It lacks organic, grassroots legitimacy.
Which brings us to Vision 2, which the text calls the Sistani model. We talked earlier about how the Iranian project was contested from within Shia theology by scholars like Kadivar.
Well, here is the institutional alternative, the other center of gravity. Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, based in the ancient holy city of Najaf in Iraq.
The Sistani model is the absolute epitome of the quietist tradition we discussed earlier regarding classical Shia thought.
It is the tradition that survived Khomeiни's revolution, watched the chaos of the Islamic Republic from across the border, and has persisted quietly and powerfully in Najaf.
How does Sistani view the role of a cleric?
Sistani's formulation is remarkably clear and traditionally grounded. Religion is absolutely vital for guiding the ethics, the personal morality, and the spiritual life of society. Clerics should speak out against injustice and corruption.
But clerics must emphatically stay away from the trappings of executive state power.
Let me try to use an analogy here. It's like the difference between a spiritual advisor who gives you profound life advice, helps you navigate moral dilemmas, and holds you accountable.
Versus a spiritual advisor who suddenly demands the keys to your car, control of your bank account, and the right to tell you who you can marry.
That is an excellent analogy. Sistani is the former. He believes the jurist is a moral guide, a stabilizing force in times of crisis, like when he rallied Iraqis against ISIS. But he is absolutely not a president, a prime minister, or a supreme leader.
He rejects Valiat Faki.
The text makes a really interesting structural contrast here. When the Sunni world lost the caliphate in 1924, they were completely unmoored. They didn't really have an alternative, universally recognized, independent center of religious authority to fall back on.
But the post-Khamenei Shia world in 2026 does have Najaf. Najaf is still there, intact, deeply respected, and offering a completely different, non-state-obsessed path.
And this leads to the critical, suspenseful question the author poses for the future. We have this massive global Shia diaspora that has just watched its oppositional, politicized identity collapse.
They have a massive amount of political, financial, and spiritual energy. Where does that energy go now?
Can the quiet, ethical, non-political framework of Anash absorb that energy? Can Sistani's model guide those disillusioned diaspora communities back to a more traditional spiritual focus, acting as a shock absorber for this trauma?
Or Akhtar suggests a darker alternative. Does the sudden vacuum of power and identity create a new, uncontrollable wave of radicalization?
Just think about history. The post-1924 vacuum in the Sunni world eventually birthed highly politicized, often militant movements like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Maududdi's Jamaat Islami in South Asia.
Will the 2026 vacuum produce a new, perhaps even more volatile, decentralized mutation of Shia political grievance, a movement that doesn't even need a state to cause chaos?
It is the ultimate open question. We are watching history unfold in real time. But the author's overarching conclusion about what this all means structurally is definitive.
He calls this collapse the Muslim world's Westphalian moment.
That is a powerful historical framing.
So what does this all mean? For those who might need a quick refresher, the Westphalian moment refers to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648.
That treaty essentially ended the horrific, decades-long religious wars in Europe between Catholics and Protestants.
He established the modern system of sovereign nation-states, basically agreeing that transnational religious empires could no longer dictate the borders of Europe. The state became supreme over the church.
Exactly. And Akhtar is saying that after a century of delay, after all the pan-Islamic aspirations, after the Khilafat movement in India, and after the bloody, exhaustive 4-decade Iranian revolutionary project,
The nation-state has definitively won in the Middle East as well. It has absorbed, domesticated, and ultimately broken transnational religious politics.
the era of the religious empire is closed.
Yes, the post-Islamist fusion of faith and freedom that Asif Bayat predicted isn't arriving through careful, enlightened reform. It's arriving because every other alternative, every attempt to build a utopian religious state has simply exhausted itself into total collapse.
The century-long battle is over. The borders hold.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. We always like to leave you with a concept to explore on your own, something that builds on our discussion today, but pushes it a little further.
If we accept Akhtar's premise that the secular nation-state has definitively won this century-long battle against transnational religious empires and caliphates, it raises a fascinating, perhaps terrifying new problem. What happens when those victorious secular nation-states fail?
Which many of them are doing right now.
Exactly. If the nation-state is now the only game in town, but it chronically fails to deliver economic prosperity, fails to provide social stability, or fails to offer a sense of justice and dignity to its citizens, where do people turn?
That eternal, deep-seated human desire for a broader, borderless collective identity hasn't vanished just because the Ayatollahs failed. Will humanity simply seek out a new kind of transnational ideology to fill that void?
That's a fascinating thought. If not religion, then what? Perhaps a transnational identity driven entirely by technology, digital communities that ignore physical borders entirely.
Or perhaps an ideology based on global economic classes uniting against inequality, completely bypassing national governments.
The religious caliphate may be gone, but the fundamental human need for a grander belonging, for a purpose larger than a national passport, is surely waiting to be filled by something else. The vacuum is still there.
A truly profound, slightly unsettling question to leave you with. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense, rewarding, and deep intellectual journey today. We hope this deep dive has helped illuminate the deep historical currents that are quietly shaping the loud headlines of our modern world. Keep asking questions, keep looking for the historical rhymes, keep connecting the dots, and we will see you next time.